Fictional Page presents Read Before Midnight, Season 1.
Episode 9, HOGS.
By W.H. Maxwell. Read by the author.
This is the second to last episode in the first season of Read Before Midnight. Thank you for making it this far. If you wish to support us, please recommend us to a friend who enjoys this sort of things. Now without delay, HOGS. The sound of the helicopter broke the silence of the morning like the unnatural thing that it was. Shadows still clung to frost in the patchwork of hills and forests below, and between the places where the early winter sun hadn't yet touched. This far north, spring was the promise of a dream waiting to come. The first buds of the season still, as the restless things between the trees whined and snorted at the intruder flying over them. They grunted and pawed at the dirt, eyes watching upward with a forbidden knowledge, as unnatural in them as the helicopter in the sky. Rob Yeager sat inside the chopper looking down, out the tiny window next to him, as the hills and trees passed by swiftly beneath. Too cold, he thought, and he was reminded of an old song about a season for things. This did not seem like the right season, for either this hunt or himself. Both were in the winter of things. "What you thinking, Rob?" The voice came through the headset, round his ears unexpectedly, still barely audible above the hum of the propellers. Rob turned to one of the two men sitting to his left, aside from the pilot, who kept to himself in the front. "It's too damn cold, Dale," Rob said, but nothing came out. Dale, his longtime hunting patron and bona fide idiot, had asked the question, but it was the sales guy from the reserve who was smiling and tapping the side of the headset. "Gotta push the talk button on the receiver, Pops," Derek said through the headset and flashing that perfect smile of his. Rob hated the guy on multiple levels, but particularly now that he had convinced his client to drag them both 1,000 miles north into the Adirondack wilderness. "I said, it's too damn cold," Rob finished this time, working the talk button. Dale laughed, and his gut rolled as he did so, even under the many thick layers. "Never stopped us before, partner. Don't go getting old on me now," Dale laughed again. He was a happy idiot, at least, and a rich one. Rob had been working with Dale, making sure he didn't drink himself to death or drive the Jeep into a ravine for the last 3 decades. After Rob's work in the military overseas, he had opened up a safari service as a way to do something new, and to lean into the hunting skills he had learned as a boy. Shortly thereafter, he had met Dale, who enjoyed Rob's delicacy to his drinking and shenanigans, and had employed him almost exclusively ever since. That he was rich and willing to pay Rob more than was standard had kept the relationship working in that time, and Rob was both grateful and sick of it. "We are old, Dale," Rob said into the headset. "Why not wait until spring has come proper, and we can camp it out light? Not to mention, there is no way in hell any of these hogs are moving in cold like that." It was Derek's turn to speak up, shaking his head. "Not true. The hogs at the reserve have been living and breeding in these parts for generations, and have exhibited some unusual behaviors not seen in their southern cousins. Or any part of the world. I would stand by that." "You breed big hogs, you mean?" Dale started. "We've hunted big hogs before, haven't we, Rob? Got ourselves a few dozen last year down in Texas." It was 3 years ago, Rob thought. He's getting funny in the head, where the booze is finally taking its toll. "Well, no offense to Texas," Derek said, raising 2 hands in mock surrender, "but I would be willing to gamble that our hogs have something on them. The reserve has been importing and breeding the pigs since the mid-'80s, with several stocks brought from overseas. Italy, Russia, Vietnam, and others. At this point, I'd be willing to go as far and say that we have the largest mixed pig population, as well as hog size per pound average, of any privately held reservation on Earth." "And what's the restock rate?" Rob asked, but Derek looked puzzled. "I'm not quite sure what you mean." "How often do you have to bring in new stock to replenish the population?" Rob went on. Derek shook his head. "We haven't had a new stock since I started with the reserve back in '09. I don't think there has been one outside the attempt in 11, but that one led to rejection of the new squall. Otherwise, the population's been self-sustaining since before I started. Mid-'90s, I would guess, if I had to pin it down, but our local guides would know more. Some of them have been on the reserve since it started." It was Rob's turn to look puzzled. Again, he cast his glance out the window, to the black rock hills and gray forests below. Almost 30 years without a restock. It was a statement, not a question. And this far north, too. I've never heard of that. Rob heard Derek give a casual laugh, but he didn't look back at him. I guess our hogs are just special, he said. The chopper landed in a circular clearing that had been cut away from the trees. Further south, tall grasses would have required weekly mowing already by this time of year. Here, though, the clearing was a patchwork of mud and snow and short, tough yellow grass that gave little motion for the approaching whir of the helicopter blades. 2 gray-covered trucks and a half-dozen people were waiting, ready to take their gear and greet them as they touched down. Once they had stepped off, Derek introduced them to the hands, as he called them, Sherpas or campfiremen in other parts of the world, Rob thought, as they took their camping gear and supplies and loaded them into the trucks. Not quite trucks either, he noticed, a kind of large, all-terrain vehicle, more like a military half-track than a proper truck. One of the hands was an older man than the others, with dark olive skin and a worn and tired expression. Derek introduced them. This is Antonio. He's been with us since the reserve first opened. Most of these guys are his men, family and friends that he's brought north from Puebla. Rob reached out and shook his hand. Pleased to meet you. Mucho gusto, Antonio said. Is this your first time on the reserve, then? First time boar hunting here? Dale chimed in at this once again. Oh, muchacho, we've done it all before. Not our first boar hunt. Antonio nodded patiently. Not quite like this, though. And Rob noted the almost perfect English, save for the little twist of D on this. Our boards are bigger, for sure, than what you've seen before. And stronger. And smarter, yes, much smarter. It is not an amateur hunt, Antonio continued. Derek cut it off there, though. I'm sure you guys will have everything taken care of, he said with a gentle laugh and a curt pat on Antonio's shoulder that said much more. These guys have the experience, and I'm sure they've managed enough boars that between you and the hands, they should have an excellent experience. Now, let's get the bags loaded so that these guys can get to their campsite before sundown. How far is the ride? Rob asked. About 3 hours, Antonio said. Maybe 2, if we can get good clearing and avoid any mud pits. This time of year, the ground begins to thaw, and normal vehicles can't go more than 5, maybe 10 feet before getting sucked in. That's why we have the haulers, he said, indicating the gray, flat-track trucks. The haulers can get through most anything, but if we hit a big pit, we may need to push one along with the other. Dale laughed. Well, pigs like mud, don't they? Maybe we'll catch a few by surprise and have us some shooting. Antonio gave Derek a cold look then, as if he'd forgot to mention something important. No, senor, he said quietly. We won't catch them by surprise. And he kept the coldness in his voice on the last words. Dale went on, unperturbed in that way that only people who get their way often do. Well, nonetheless, we didn't just fly over an hour in a helicopter to wait until tomorrow to get some shooting. Why don't we have a little trek while the rest of the hands go ahead and set up the camp? It's best if we, Antonio had started to say, but then Garrett gave him another hearty pat on the back. If you guys want to get right to it, then we can certainly make that happen, Derek went on. Antonio, why don't you get the rifles and gear out and take Dale and his man out for a little jaunt? Give them something for their money's worth before they reach camp, all right? It wasn't a question so much as a statement, Rob noticed. Also, Dale and his man? His man. What was that shit? Rob took the money, but he hated rich people. Antonio nodded and, keeping his silence, waved over to a few of the other men and began to relay the message. With that, Derek waited a moment longer while they split the gear and got Dale and Rob on their way, before stepping back into the helicopter and ascending. As they watched from the ground, the chopper rose higher and higher before tilting forward. In a minute, the thing was gone, leaving behind only the fading sound of its blades, until there was only silence, wind, and the sound of men shuffling. Well, that is that, then. We getting this hunt on or what? Dale said, pulling a silver flask from his jacket pocket and taking a swig. Antonio looked disapprovingly, but knew well enough then to question the clients, Rob guessed, unless he wanted more pats on the back from that asshole Derek. "We have the rifles loaded into the first of the haulers," Antonio said. "The others will ride ahead to base camp and set up the tents and start the food." "Well, I hope they know how to cook hog," Dale went on, taking another sip from the flask, "because that's what we're eating tonight." Rob ignored him. "Did you get the 308 as requested?" he asked. Antonio nodded. "The office put in the request, and the men loaded them in this morning. We also have the 212 gauges, buckshot, and slug, as well as the ARs and the minis. The ARs are standard 227, the minis are specialized 45, but only hold half the capacity." Rob didn't make much of the assortment of firearms. He had seen enough weapons during his time in the military and after to be surprised by much. The larger calibers might be excessive, especially if they were hoping to actually eat any of the meat, but it wasn't really about that. Rich people like their guns as much as anyone else, and if hunting boar, there would be chances, he supposed, to test each one. If Dale didn't get too drunk and pass out, that was. Before long, the first hauler had taken off at a golf cart's pace over the hard ground. Antonio, Dale, Rob, and another one of the hands, a younger man named Max, finished checking the rifles and ensured that they had the proper magazines and backup ammo for each. Once they were ready, Antonio took the driver's seat while Dale called "shotgun." Jesus, he's like a little kid. And Rob and Max sat in the back bench. The gear was separated by a wall that encased the bed of the truck, so the guns and ammunition sat on the other side in the back compartment. The only way in was the little door around the back of the truck. Then they were moving. Antonio kept them at a slow but steady pace up the first of the hills, through a thicket of pines. It was narrow, and branches scraped on the meadow above them, like long fingers stretching down to caress them. There was little visibility from the back, so Rob leaned to the side and could see large sections of black rock jutting from between still frost-covered trees. Some of the trees had large sections torn out, their trunks cut deep by numerous slashes. "Christ on a cracker, Antonio," Dale chimed in. "You boys cut the path just wide enough, huh?" Antonio shook his head. "That's the HOGS, not us." "What's that?" Dale asked, not following. "They cut down their tusks on them," Antonio went on. "It marks the territory with their scent, and they will take strips of the bark back to their nests." "Never heard of that," Rob said from the back. "Marking their scent, yes, but taking the bark back to nest?" "It's not surprising, really," Antonio said, still navigating the hauler carefully up the hill. "It's adaptation. Pigs are not native to the Americas, after all. They came with people, with Columbus and Hernando de Soto, from the conquistadors, and like their masters they spread west and south, and eventually north." The kid next to Rob, Max, was staring out the little silver window he had, one leg bouncing anxiously. "That's so, huh?" Dale said, pulling his flask out and taking a quick nip. It was not a question or even a statement as much as a response impulse, Rob thought, wondering how much of Dale was ever really there. "But why now?" Rob asked. "I've hunted enough hogs from Texas to Dakota to warthogs in Kenya. Hogs living through the winter, nesting, as you put it, amigo, that's something new." Antonio shrugged. "Adaptation, like I said. Back maybe 30, 40 years ago, the reserve started this branch and brought in the European, Italian, and Russian boars to crossbreed. Since then, the stock has remained steady through the winters. No additional feeding, no new stock has been needed now, and I've personally advised against it, myself. No new pigs." Antonio used the little radio device in the cab to speak to the other group in a quick burst of Spanish, waited until they responded, then nodded and said something back and put the receiver down. "Cell phones don't work this far out, so we equipped the trucks with little radios a while back." The hauler cleared the crest of the hill, and light shone in through the windshield. Sky dappled gray by the clouds. The light was almost cold. Beneath his layers of thermal and wool, Rob shivered and huffed and saw his breath. How cold was it? "Almost above freezing," Antonio said, as if reading his mind. "If you stay in the sunlight, but it will still be cold here until late May." Rob almost asked again how any hogs could live that long in the cold, but refrained, already knowing Antonio's answer. Adaptation. Rob thought the man himself must have gone through something of an adaptation to live in this climate, so far from home, and alone in the forest more times than not. How do we find us some hogs, then? Dale asked, propping himself upright further. Looks like we could spot a few ridges from here, eh? You must know some good spots we could get in early. Rob could see the space here leveling out, the trees scattered more loosely. A few of the trees, a whole line of them, dropped down suddenly, a few dozen yards away, and he knew there must be a ridgeline there. He felt more alive then, his brain beginning to awaken from its fog, the sense of the hunt upon them. They will find us before we find them, senor, Antonio said. These hogs nest, you say? Rob asked plainly. They do, Antonio said. They make tunnels in the snow and rock, and line them with bark and, cattails for insulation. Big animals in cold weather make a lot of steam, don't they? Rob asked, more pointedly this time. Antonio's face hardened a little, but he nodded. They do, yes. You can see them sometimes, especially from the chopper, if you have infrared. Rob pointed to the ridge lines they were toting past at a snail's pace. Does that ridge lead down to a river or stream? If so, I imagine they're nesting somewhere between the water source and this ridgeline.
Possible, Antonio said. Perhaps. We can't take the hauler down the slope, or even near it. The ground is too soft for the big machines. Dale patted his legs, in a gesture meant to instill confidence, but had the opposite effect. These legs can still hoof it through some backcountry. I'm not all finance and boardrooms, you know. Rob nodded, and Antonio brought the half-track to a stop a few moments later. Max, the kid, seemed to snap too, and hopped out of the truck with them, reaching the back hatch first. He unlocked the door, and loaded the rifle with a familiar ease that Rob typically only saw in trained soldiers, chalking it up to growing up on a hunting reserve. Antonio seemed to have a less hasty approach, waiting for Rob and Dale to finish gearing up before taking one of the shotguns. When they were ready, Antonio took the lead where Rob had indicated, toward the slope of the tree line. The little clearing along the path was gone in a few steps, their boots crunching on frosted ground, surrounded by old oaks, maples, and hemlocks. They went, Dale behind Rob, with Max coming up behind him. Antonio pointed to the tusk marks that lined the trees closest to the road, like a border. Tusk markings, he said softly. The boar used the glands in their mouth to cut the trees and leave a smell behind that marks the territory. We're in their forest now. Dale chuckled a bit at this and patted his rifle, and Rob nodded patiently. Then they continued. The slope began to steepen, and as they got within sight of the ridge, they began going around and down the hill, switchback style. About 3/4 of the way down, the trees parted enough for a view of the ridge in both directions, and the hills in front of them beyond the little gorge. Down there, Antonio indicated, is the little stream that separates the reserve from the rest of the park. That side over there is owned by the state of Maine, the other Vermont, and then Canada to the north, with all hills and lake country in between. How did the hogs stay in bounds of the territory, Rob asked, indicating the far side of the bottom of the gorge. There's a small trench and a fence that run the perimeter on the side closest to us, just before the stream. The top is wired and barbed. If the pigs try to cross, it will not kill, but, deter them? The whole perimeter? Rob asked, then clarified. The fence, does it run the entire line? Antonio shook his head. No, only until the natural barriers. This is one of the places, but the whole thing's since settled on a little mesa, a plateau. Cliffs and stronger currents cut off the other sides. Rob nodded, thinking. That means they're effectively boxed in on this side. If we can find them, then we should have done our day's work. He said after a moment, if they're nested up here somewhere along this hillside, how long before we'd have to wait them out of their holes? Antonio shook his head in a back-and-forth fashion. Hard to say. Maybe. In summer they are most active at dawn and dusk. Winter, they sleep more. Now in spring, maybe some are waking up a bit early. He paused, stroking the stubble of his chin under his parka. It's midday now. If we wait and watch, we may see. Rob looked back to Dale,
who was scouting out the ridgeline with the scope of his rifle. He's half in the bag now, midday, and still 4 more hours to go before we're likely to see any hogs, and he's already shucked off down the bottle. Rob thought that, regardless of when the hogs came out, Dale was likely to stay only as long as his flask was full, before demanding their return to camp. Unless he had another flask. The whole thing was beginning to feel like the joke it ultimately was. Dragged halfway across America so a rich guy could drink without his wife hassling him. "Well, shit," Dale almost said on cue. "I don't see a damn thing out here. You sure you guys got pigs out here?" His voice a little too loud in the still morning air. "Yes," Antonio said, displaying the same patience he had used with his boss, Derek. "They're out here. But like I said, we won't just sneak up on them. They're smart. They listen. Are you sure you would not rather go back to camp with the others and wait until nightfall? They are more active then. They have But Dale cut him off. "Adapted, yep, okay. But I'm out here paying good money, so I'm going to wait them out if I want. Been on enough safaris and pig hunts, amigo. No need to pamper me." Rob exchanged an apologetic glance with Antonio, the older man unfaltering in his patience. He has adapted as well, Rob thought again. Haven't we all? So they waited, all 4 of them on the little flat lying a few yards from the ridge. Dale talked about boar hunting in Texas, and Rob threw in the occasional affirmation. Meanwhile, his mind wandered. His eyes looked out at the scene of white and gray and black, stillness and dark rock, as frigid and unforgiving as the air. No buds on trees. This was not a place they were meant to be. It was as foreign a man's purpose as the moon or the bottom of the ocean. If you lived here, you had to know how, and take on a different kind of purpose than someone like Dale. This land would not tolerate the lost and the weak. He was sure of that. Half an hour later, Dale was pacing back and forth, while Antonio and Max were chattering away in Spanish. That's when Rob spotted it. A little line of black that jagged in and out of the slope, closest to them. It wasn't much, barely there at all from his distance, but the pattern was as clear as day once he saw it. "Antonio," Rob called. "Hey, Antonio, come here. Look. Look." He pulled the other man in closer, shoulder to shoulder, and indicated with a level hand from the other's eyeline. "Can you see it?" he asked. "There, running parallel between the slope and the creek. You see it?" Antonio nodded. Yes, classic patterning there. The hoofs cause rifts in the soil. Rain, snowmelt. As soon as the water starts to get in there, the erosion starts. It does bad things to the trees, especially on the hills. These must be fresh, so good eye, Mr. Rob." What is it?" Dale came up from behind them, half falling on Rob. "We found something? You see something, Rob?" "Yeah," Rob said, unfazed and unsurprised. "There's a sounder trail up there on that hillside, leading down to the river. See it?" Rob indicated, and Dale nodded, almost sagely, and said he did. But Rob knew he didn't. "If we head back to the holler and ride up the pass another half-mile or so, we should be able to connect right back up with it and follow them back down," he finished. Dale nodded, again, this time a little more vigorously. "Agreed. Solid plan, Rob. That's why I pay you the big bucks." He patted him on the arm, and once again he and Antonio passed a look of quiet solidarity. Adaptation. Max led the way back up this time, his younger legs carrying them with an ease the others longed for. He would stop ahead every few paces to wait for them to catch up, before dashing off another few yards like a deer in flight. Dale, conversely, lagged winded behind Antonio, leaving Rob to make sure he didn't slough it backwards and hit his head on a rock. They were passing the large patch of woods near the road where the boars had drawn their line. Rob could appreciate them more this time, walking slower, observing. He saw the patchwork of markings that dug deep into the trunks. He saw the peeled-back pieces of bark the size of a man's forearm, each cross-section stitched up in a broad X-shaped swath. Rob could tell some of the trees that had been dug up were getting soft in the bark, rotting away slowly where the tusks had cut them. Rob could see that some of the marks were newer than the others, more recent, too. Back in the holler, Antonio started up the engine, and the others packed inside. Once again they were moving, this time silently, as though a whispered nothing passed between them. Outside the wind stood, and the trees were hushed. The engine rumbled them along slowly. Rob kept peeking out through the front, one hand resting on the passenger seat where Dale sat, making sure they were going the right way. Not that much of it was his choice, or anyone else's. The forest dug in on both sides so that the trail was the only way through. Miles of single lane of rock and mud cut between the trees. All along, like a fence marking their passage, trunks were slashed in a patchwork of X's. When Rob looked up higher at some of the older ones, he could see the faint outline of what might have been other markings from long ago. But maybe he was imagining it, too. He kept his eyes to the path ahead, and where he thought the hillside he'd spotted earlier would be between the trees. About halfway there, they came to a fork in the road. The first clearing they had seen since the top of the ridge. The pathway widened, and then diverted two ways. One way went straight and slightly right, and downhill toward the ridge, or where Rob thought the ridge line should be. The other banked harder to the left, and began taking an easy grade upward through a nestle of trees. This pathway, the one to the left, had a fresh set of tracks running through it. "That is the way the others went earlier," Antonio said, indicating the path that went uphill to their left. "I'm guessing that they are almost to camp by now. Maybe an hour and a half ahead of us. If we go that way now, we can catch up." "Like hell," Dale said, the first word since they'd left the ridge. "I'm eating some boar tonight. I'm telling you guys, this isn't my first rodeo. Damn, I paid good money. Now, don't go getting lazy on me, Antonio. Tell them, Rob, we know what we're doing." Antonio looked at Rob, who simply nodded. There was, as they both knew, no point arguing. Dale was perhaps sobering up, or the rest in the holler had given him the second wind he thought would make the difference. Much like the boar they must be hunting, Rob thought, Dale was stubborn and sticking to the survival he knew best. Some of them adapted, and the rest didn't make it through the winter. Rob knew which kind Dale would be. The hauler lurched back into gear with a jerk, then moved forward and took them to the right. Tilting slightly as they began moving down the hill, Antonio moved them at a crawl, easing the wheel gently back and forth. He knew how to handle the vehicle on the slopes. Rob could see easily this was not the first time he had managed this. "This trail maintained year-round, or only in the summer?" he asked, raising his voice to be heard above the little whine. "We usually cut at the start and end of the summer," Antonio replied, not taking his eyes off the narrow path. "Most of the trails stay pretty flat and sparse, at least to the edges, from the traffic and the haulers, but some, like this one, are a bit less trafficked." "You know this one, though, right?" Rob asked cautiously. "I don't want us getting stuck out here in a pit. If we have to stop and hoof it, that might be for the best." "I've got it," he said confidently. "I know this whole reserve, and this trail too. There's a spot a little further ahead that we could slip us up, but I'm not sure if we'd have an issue with the ground or not. It doesn't matter, though. We won't be going that far anyways." And he was right. Another 10 minutes of meandering at a snail's pace. The path leveled out a little, and there was room enough to open the doors. Here, Antonio kept the thing firmly in the middle of the path, where the ground was firmest. Rob felt the air was actually a little warmer down here, and a little more humid. The frost still clung to the patches where the sun didn't cut in, and there were plenty of those. The ground beneath them was solid enough anyways. Again, they removed the rifles, and Rob saw Dale finish off the silver flask he'd been nipping from. He thought it would be a wonder if he ever saw Dale sober in this life again. He wondered how many he had put down before they even got to the hotel lobby before the helicopter. Did it even matter? At their age, what was he fretting about? Wasn't that the point of retirement and money and having fun? Wasn't that the American dream? Out here, without the trappings of lights and sound to distract him? Rob wasn't so sure. Along the tree line as they passed, walking further into the forest and away from the hauler, Rob saw the markings again. These ones were deeper, and there was a smell in the cold air too, something that clung on the wind like bad meat in a freezer. Their footsteps sounded like boots on broken glass as the half-frozen ground eased and then broke with every other step. The sun was well past its resting point midway in the sky, and had begun its downward passing to the western horizon. Then they found it. Antonio brought them to a stop, raising his hand and lowering his voice again. "Keep quiet from here on out," he said. "Look, you see here?" They couldn't have missed it, not even Dale. A little trench, wide enough for a man to comfortably walk through, had been carved into the dirt by many hooves trotting back and forth. A few inches deep, it was wide enough for 2 feet, and could have been made by the Park Service, Rob thought, if they ventured this far north. Wide set, flat toes, tracks stiff and frozen now, splayed out, as wide as their boot prints. "Jesus! You see that track, Rob?" Dale exclaimed, a little too loudly, and Antonio hushed him. "What did that guy Derek say, huh? Biggest hogs you've ever seen? This is what I'm talking about. Now this is what $30K a pop will get you. Can you believe it?" Rob couldn't, actually. He was shocked, almost stunned to silence. He had expected them to be big, but every reserve owner claims their animals are the biggest, the most feral, the most dangerous, the most real to the monsters of the past. But this was something else entirely. Rob remembered the first time he'd seen a grizzly print on one of his northern expeditions as a young man. Back then, he'd only ever heard about them at that point and had no real appreciation of the animals. When he saw the footprint of one of the big lone male bears, however, he'd begun to understand the size of the thing and put himself into perspective. This moment reminded him of that, of sudden appreciation for the unexpected. It made him nervous. "How big do the swells get?" was Rob's next question, his voice little more than a rustle. "Usually not too big," Antonio said with a hand resting on the butt of his shotgun, still slung across his back. 2 dozen, 3 dozen tops. Rob nodded. At least there was that. Southern squalls could reach into the hundreds, and that both worked for and against them. They might be harder to find, if only a handful, but a stampede of these things, of animals this size, would be more like something from a western about cattle ranchers and rustlers. That was at least what Rob thought, looking at the prints in the ground before him. His own boot was barely larger than the tracks he saw. A few of them it was smaller. Less meant they should be harder to find. Rob wasn't sure that was a bad thing anymore. "This way, then," Antonio said, standing in the pathway the hooves had carved into the side of the hill, and indicating downward toward the stream. They followed. A hunting experience like no other, Rob thought of the brochure Dale had showed him after signing them up. Tackle the great northern boar and see the marvelous landscape. Stuck in a pig's rut, moving downhill on a zigzag game trail between heartless black rock and frozen earth was hardly marvelous in his mind. He was cold. It was going to be dark soon, and he didn't want to be out here then. They were almost down the hill now, bobbing up and down between the lip of the path and the trees and rocks bunched around them. His ankles hurt like needles in the way that only comes with age. Dale wheezed along behind him, either too drunk or too sober to complain. All of them, except for maybe Max, with his younger body, seemed tired now, each movement heavy from exhaustion and age and cold. The trail disappeared near the bottom of the hill. There it scattered out, many hooves going in different directions. They could see the stream now, little more than a trickle, half frozen and no more than a dozen feet wide. And they could see the little trench and the fence running around the other side, too. Nowhere to go, Rob thought, looking left and right. Tall trees lined the banks. "Should be nesting up here, then, eh?" he called out to Antonio. Antonio nodded in a polite way. "They come out at night, but we don't keep track of the individual dens. The entrances move. The hogs, they don't like to stay in one place too long. Not enough food. They have to roam. It's best to spot at night, with the red light, or wait until they come out into the open." The wind moaned, and the trees along the edge of the water shook. They eyed the hillside behind them, could see the trails dart into and out of eyesight between the forest, like stripes on a tiger. Rob was not sure what he was expecting to find. He was hoping that the signs of their nest would be more visible, but it had taken so long to get down the hill. They were bound to be here at dark before they saw anything scurry out. Even then, with Dale pickled and the sun half departed, They were going to line fire at a squall if they happened to come across one. The whole thing stank. "Let's make our way through the bank, come back around, see if we find trail or markings," he said, feeling unsure of himself for the first time in many years. Not since he was a kid, and they had dropped him and the rest of the boys off in some hot jungle halfway around the world. And this was what it felt like, too, somehow, like he was in a foreign and hostile nation. It was far from his first time stalk hunting an animal, and they were in a good position to do so. The wind was pushing away from them, carrying their scent across the river. The red light was beyond what the pigs could see, so when the time came, they could move mostly unnoticed. Even still, it felt like they were the ones being watched, like the very trees were giving them up, and the little stream and rocks and frozen earth were turned against them. It was so silent, Rob realized suddenly. No signs of any birds or squirrels or deer. They walked along the tree line in a short spread, Antonio taking the lead and setting a slow pace. Rob took last. Max looked on edge as ever, and even Dale seemed to have noticed the tension, or at least had gone quiet like the rest of them. Tusk marks lined most of the trees in this part of the forest, and Rob could smell them on the edge of the stinging cold, an almost human smell. But the sun was setting fast in the sky, and the cold was following the shadows down the hill, pursuing the fleeing sun. It wasn't that there were too few tracks, Rob realized. It was that there were so many. Hoofprints sagged and pulled at the dirt here and there, crisscrossing about like mouse pathways in a forgotten cellar. Plants uprooted, trees marked, reeds scattered about, and the rocks by the river and along the fence, thrown like a herd of cattle, came through to drink. And the silence. Most of all, the silence. Antonio came to a stop and turned to face them. "We should come to a stop here for now," he said. "Tonight, after reaching camp, we can try again, or tomorrow during sunup might be a better time." They all nodded, including Dale, who seemed to have less bravado and more sober and winded. Rob led the way this time, taking them back toward the trail they had followed down. Antonio came up to walk beside him. "We can get back to base camp and try again in a few hours," he said. "Use some infrared to spot them and spot hunting with the red lights." "We can get more done if we wait until morning, or even tomorrow night," Rob said, looking back at Dale a few paces behind them, focusing on his boots and keeping his walking steady. "He needs at least a night's, maybe a day's rest." Antonio nodded respectfully, keeping whatever thoughts he had to himself. Adaptation. "What happened to the last stock?" Rob asked. "Pardon?" "The last stock of pigs. Group of hogs you brought in for the restock. What happened? Why'd you guys stop bringing them in?" Antonio cocked his head sideways a little and paused, before saying, "They ate them." "Who?" Rob asked, already knowing. "The other pigs. The ones we keep here. They introduced the new group, but over the next couple of weeks, we noticed the numbers dropping. By the end of that summer, there were none from the new group left. All of them have been killed and eaten. One or two were hunted by guests, yeah, but most were killed by the hogs." Antonio finished, matter-of-factly. "I have never heard of that. Pigs eating other pigs? At least not killing them themselves for food," Rob said. It was cold, and the sun was getting lower. The path seemed so much steeper now going uphill, and he could hear Dale grunting along behind them. "They are omnivores, no?" Antonio said. "Mostly they eat the plants. The birds and the little animals have long since been game for them in the reserve, and the deer know to avoid this place. The food, of course, is supplemented by blocks of grain we haul in, but they are a growing population, and we take what they can get." "But cannibalism?" Rob said. "I've heard of boar eating a deer carcass, but never another pig." "It's only cannibalism," Antonio said, "if they think they are still the same. What is a pig compared to a deer or any other animal? It's adaptation." There was a loud oomph sound, like something heavy falling over, and then a loud wail. Rob sprung around, and Antonio flicked on his flashlight, and a red beam colored the hillside. Dale was laying on the ground, shrieking and reaching for his leg. Max was already beside him, one hand on his arm, trying to calm him down. Rob went over and down to one side. "My leg!" Dale sobbed. "My damn leg!" Rob felt along his leg, down past the knee into the ankle, which was bent slightly and already swelling. It was hot to the touch despite the cold, and he could begin to feel Dale's pulse racing in the spot. "Not broken," Rob said, reassuring him, "but you twisted it pretty bad. What happened?" "Slipped it up in one of these pig holes like an idiot," he seethed, trading pain for anger. Rob convinced him after a moment to try standing. When he buckled, Rob and Max each took one arm to support him and started moving again. They were only halfway up the hill and back to the hauler at this point, and parts of the trail were too narrow or steep for both of them to walk Dale up. At those spots, Rob would walk with Dale, while Max supported them from behind. The kid never took his hand off the shotgun the whole way up. Dale whimpered into the growing dark, with only the wind calling back. It was night by the time they reached the clearing in the trees and found the hauler. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. Max and Rob loaded Dale into the back seat, with Max managing to squeeze himself into the far side so Dale could lay out. Rob sat next to Antonio in the front as the others powered up the hauler and turned on the overhead lights. The vehicle did a multi-point turn on the narrow pathway until it was facing forward again. And this time, Antonio kept the engine pushing a little harder to keep momentum up the hill. As he drove, he took the little handheld piece for the radio and put it to his lips and spoke in rapid Spanish that Rob didn't understand. After a moment, he said it again, more frustrated. An odd look came across his face. "Hello?" he said. "Hello. ¿Está ahí?" "What is it?" Rob asked, seeing the look on the other's face. "Nothing," Antonio said. "Radio signal's shit up here. Cell phone is shit up here. These hills were not made for the 21st century." Rob agreed with him there. The hauler seemed to struggle up the hill and through the more muddy parts. Once, near the top of the ridge and close to the fork in the road, the hauler slipped a tread, and the whole truck lurched back into one side. It had only been for a moment, and Antonio had regained control seconds later, but Rob had seen a vision in his mind of how isolated and alone they would be if stuck out here, at least until the helicopter came back in 3 days, or the hands found them. The lights from the hauler came back down and into focus at the top of the hill, illuminating in glaring yellow and white the clearing at the fork. Shadows seemed to cut like a knife through and around the light, casting down from the trees and the tufts of grass, shining back like the absent moon off the snow. Rob looked out and saw the left fork, now to their right, the path not taken earlier, as Antonio guided them along toward it. The little engine rumbled in the silent night. "Still another hour," Antonio said. They went over another big bump, and Dale moaned out a curse. He cursed the pigs, the hole he stumbled on, Rob for letting him take the trip. Rob did not remind him that it was Dale who convinced and paid him to come along. For his wife, for Jesus. The others remained silent through this until he quieted himself down. It began to rain. It was gentle at first, noticeable only by the tiny arc of a drop crossing the high beams, or the little tapping on the roof of the hauler. Thunder soon called, however, from somewhere on high in the clouds, and the rain came following. Fat drops, like from a garden spigot, began to roll on, one after the other. Cold and half ice, they came in sheets driven by gusts of northern wind. Again, the black clouds above them rumbled, and the ground shook for a moment. The engine on the truck sounded small and dim. It managed on, though. Antonio looked on edge, more awake then than he had been on the trails, his hands both clinging tightly to the wheel. "The storm won't last," he said after a moment, not looking off the road. "The big boomers like this one come in quick and are gone within the hour. It may drizzle for a bit, but unless we get hit by a tree, we should be fine." Rob looked back at Dale, his head resting against the side of Max. Dale was half asleep, half in pain, but Max looked alert and on edge. He kept peering out of what little window he had to see. Rob didn't blame him. He wanted to be back at camp too. The whole thing was an uncomfortable shit show, top to bottom. True enough to what Antonio had said, the worst part of the rain eased up as they wound their way up the gentle grade. A light sprinkling of drops and the occasional bellow of distant thunder here and there. The storm was passing, though. It had all but stopped by the time they came to the clearing and spotted the campsite. It took them all a moment to realize what it was they were looking at. The holler came to a stop a few dozen feet from where the edge of the camp should have been. The other holler was rolled onto its side nearby. The windows and front smashed in. What looked like, Rob thought, no, what was a human leg was dangling out the driver's side window, like it had been during the war. It was both completely surreal and hyper-real at the same time. Opening the door and stepping out seemed almost dreamlike, but he could smell the blood in the air, and he remembered what that was like too. Not animal blood. When there was enough blood in the air, enough people hurt badly, or dead, you could smell the copper in the air, that metallic twang that sent the brain into overdrive. It felt like stepping into the impossible, like he was a kid overseas again for the first time, but knew in the same moment that everything his eyes saw was real and happening. The tents, ripped and dragged to pieces, scattered about the clearing of trees, overturned tables and bags and cans of food. Rob recognized one of his own hunting vests, shredded to ribbons by a stack of their luggage. Next to it was a mass of bloody clothes and twisted, mangled features. Nothing recognizable of the person it had been, save a hand that extended in a meaningless gesture outward. Most of the electric lanterns had been stomped by strong hoof feet, but a few still lay scattered about like wounded fireflies. Rob moved forward on feet that carried him of their own action. He moved about the remains of the tents, past the overturned hauler. The passenger inside was just the leg, still stretched out the window. The rest was nowhere to be seen, dragged off somewhere, he supposed. There was another one not far from there, or what must have been where the person fell. Little was left, but the sneakers were still pointed downward, like the rapture had come, and the owner had simply vanished. But they had been people, Rob thought. Only hours ago when the helicopter touched down. They had been people, men, the same men he saw only a little while ago. It felt like Vietnam. Time was doing its little dance around black and white lines, alive 1 minute, gone the next, never to return. So close, yet infinitely far away. What had happened? Antonio was shouting, had been for a moment, but Rob had completely missed any of that. His eyes, and the sight in front of them, had drowned out his other senses. Antonio was screaming now, afraid and angry. He was shouting towards the truck. It was Spanish, Rob realized, and at the same time understood he was telling Max to get the guns. When the boy started to move, dropping Dale like a sack in the process, Dale started to whine again. "What's going on? Somebody needs to come help me get out of this damn truck. I can't do it by myself now. Rob?" Dale said pitifully. "Rob!" Rob followed Antonio, who was moving toward the campsite now, or what was left of it. "What's happening?" he said, his voice a quiver, already knowing. "You see? Come on, idiot. You have eyes, no?" Antonio was not hot, like Rob had expected. Instead, he had gone ice cold. "It's the pigs. The pigs did this," Antonio said, his hand gestures out, extending the red light he had used only a few hours ago to guide them back to the hauler. Now it shone outwards over a field of debris, patches of cloth, shredded tents, clothing, and pants and toilet paper, little toiletries, toothpaste and deodorant, and the bodies lay scattered about. Max ran up beside them, his own shotgun slung low, and he passed Antonio the other. He had nothing for Rob, and did not look at him. The two of them spoke in Spanish that was too fast and complex for Rob to grasp. Then they began calling out names, and walking among the remains, checking the bodies, seeing if it were alive. Rob stood there, the wet grass, and now rain, sodden ground soaking cold against his boots and pant legs. He felt useless, like a ghost already, watching a scene play out before him. He looked around, left and right, and saw and smelt the death. At his feet, thick, sloppy prints, forked hooves, the size of two of his own, tracked back and forth across the camp. He looked back at the light of the hauler, could see Dale sitting up inside, and decided to walk back. He stepped in something thick and looked down to see his boot ankle deep in pig shit. He walked straight to the back of the hauler and took out the .308 and two of the extra magazines and stuffed them into his pocket. Then he checked the rifle was loaded and ready and went back to the passenger side where Dale was. "The hell is going on, Rob? Why are we stopping? Are we at camp yet? I am tired as hell, and they promised us a meal service in the package." "Everyone is dead," Rob said without any patting it. "The hogs came through and ripped up the camp, and I don't think any of the hands made it. I saw the bodies. Antonio and Max are searching right now, but I don't." "What?" Dale said, his face contorted now more with annoyance than with pain. When no answer came, he repeated himself. "Rob, what do you mean? When are we making it to camp? I've got a sprained ankle, and I need to rest up. There's nobody here. Do you get that? Everyone that was here, or is still, is dead," Rob said, more matter-of-fact than he felt. The words sounded like they came from someone else, like he was deep underwater. "What?" Dale repeated, no sense of understanding. Antonio was back with Max, both of them hopping into the hauler. Dale whined as Max moved in with no regard anymore for his swollen ankle, while Antonio turned on the engine and tried the radio again. This time he adjusted the frequency and called out, "Main base," his voice more panicked than Rob had ever heard. "We've got an incident. We need medical to Field 1 now. Now. Do you understand me? Copy." There was a long pause before another voice spoke back that sounded weary. "Who is this?" "Antonio Castrillo. Damn it, you listen. We need medical to Field 1. We have people hurt and more missing." The panic was becoming a sense of anger and desperation. "We need to get the guests out of the reserve. We are going to the landing field, and we need a helicopter sent out right now. Do you understand me?" Another long pause. "We can't get a chopper out at night in this weather. Hell, we don't even have a pilot on duty. Who is this again? Are you with the field team? One of the hands?" Antonio pushed the receiver to his forehead in an act of frustration. There was a noise then, somewhere in the darkness of the trees, beyond where the beams of the light touched. Gently, almost hesitantly, Antonio patted the shotgun resting in his lap. Rob took a step closer to the passenger side door. "Look, if you need to get out, take the service entrance through Section A. We'll send out the medical team. You'll probably meet them going the other way. Do you know how to get to the exit by Section A?" the voice said. "Yes," Antonio said, his eyes looking out into the darkness. "Copy that," said the voice then. "How bad is it?" A bolt of thunder flashed then, distant but bright, and the whole world was cast in an instant of daylight. In that split second, they could see then the many figures and shapes just beyond the tree line, watching them, pawing the dirt, and raising their tusked snouts in defiance. Dozens, Rob saw. Maybe hundreds. He got back into the hauler and closed the door, and Antonio began to drive them back the way they had come. No one spoke for the first few minutes. The little engine puttered, and the wind outside gave little gusts. The occasional raindrop sounded both small and incredibly close. And there was something else, Rob thought, just out of earshot. So many feet on sodden ground. "Well, just how bad is it?" Dale asked, finally breaking the silence. "We don't need to go back on my account. It's just an angle." Antonio and Rob looked at each other then, both thinking that telling him would be pointless. That could actually make things worse. That maybe Dale was just better drunk and unaware, for himself and everyone else. When neither of them said anything, Rob found the words. "Don't worry about it, Dale," Rob said. "We just need to move out of the park and all because of rain and an accident with the other hauler." It was so false, but the words just came. Because they had to, he thought. And somewhere beneath it all, Dale must have understood some of it too, because he didn't challenge it. Instead, he just nodded and slumped back down, making a little more room for Max this time. They drove on, and the sound just beyond the tree line followed. The hauler started to skid on the way down, not for long, but a few seconds long enough for Rob to feel his gut jerk back into his throat. Again, he thought of them coming to a stop and getting stuck. Worse yet, crashing and having to walk back on foot. He thought of that and wondered about the men at camp and how long they had to move. How long had they had before they realized something was seriously wrong? Rob thought that the truck had been flipped onto its side, and what must have happened to the owner of that leg. Antonio straightened them out and kept it steady for the rest of the way, until they made it back to the crossroads. When the truck turned right, the high beams casting along toward the pathway back, toward the helicopter pad, and the exit to the reserve, they saw the tree. It was a thick, old pine that had frayed and fractured at the trunk, falling sideways across the road like a blockade. The hauler came to a sliding stop in the mud,
a few feet away from the fallen trunk. "Shit," Antonio said. "Shit, shit, shit." Max said something to him in Spanish then, and Antonio spit back a response. Rob didn't understand it, but still understood it all the same. "Don't panic. Don't panic. Not yet." "Let's get out and take a look. Try to move it," Rob said, stepping out of the truck, his boots landing with a squish. The tree was at least 3 feet wide at its midsection, with thick branches and bushy limbs pushing out and away from its center. Rob moved along and down the thing until he came to the side where the trunk had given out. He found his own flashlight in his pocket and turned it on, shining it down to get a better look. Antonio came up beside him then, shotgun lowered, his red light casting about. They both saw it. The vicious cuts to the base of the tree, almost saw-like digging through the bark. But it was the roots that gave out first. The ground dug out and pushed up, and the tree had nothing to hold it into the mud. Rob couldn't believe it, but the color of Antonio's face told him it must be true. "It just gave out because of the rain," Rob offered an explanation. "Right?" "Let's get back in the hauler," Antonio said. "We can take it down to the fence line by the stream and use the hauler to get over it. From there, we go around and back down to the exit, other side of the fence." Rob shook his head, pointing at the truck. "There's no way he will make it back down that trail. Not with that ankle, especially now at night and in this mud. Hell, none of us will." "We won't take the trail," Antonio said. "If we keep taking the pathway, there's a gateway for the service entrance for the vehicles shed. It's outside the fence line. We go down, open the gate, then take the hauler back. Once there, we refuel, and we go back along the long way to the main exit on Section A. We take that back to the main road, and we stay outside the fence." Rob nodded, not thinking of a better way. It was a good shot, their best shot of getting out of here soon. He rubbed water off his forehead, looking once more at the fallen tree. Then they got back into the hauler and turned back around one more time. Antonio explained to Max what the plan was in Spanish, while Rob and Dale more or less the same thing. When they started the descent back down the pathway toward the stream, Rob kept silent and clung involuntarily to the little handle by the door. He felt like he was back in the chopper, less sure of his own fate than he would like, but trusting Antonio to keep them from sliding off the road. Rob reminded himself that they hadn't seen any pigs this way either, earlier at least, and he tried not to think about all the hoof prints that had been carving away at the side of that hill. Tried not to think about all the tusk markings. Tried not to think about the silence they had felt just hours before. Somehow, the silence had been the worst part. It felt like an eternity waiting, Rob and the others watching as the high beams did a hypnotic dance over the passing trees. Then they felt the ground level out under them and saw the gate in front. It was little more than an overly secure pasture gate, the kind they would use on a ranch to enclose large horses or cattle. This one was especially high and had a double-barrel latch with a padlock. Antonio brought the hauler to a stop a few dozen paces before it. The high beam shone brightly off the reflective metal. "I go unlock it," he said. Max will drive the hauler through, and then I get back in the other side, and we go, okay? Rob nodded, and then Antonio gave Max the plan, and the boy nodded. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. Max wrangled around Dale and took the driver's seat, keeping the engine running. They watched in the bright white light as Antonio marched toward the gate, keeping his shotgun leveled and his head turning back and forth, on alert. He made it to the gate without incident, and put his gun down to reach into his pocket. A large set of keys came out with his hand, and he fumbled with them for a moment before finding the right one. Then he unlocked the padlock on the fence, and it fell into the mud with a wet clop. Antonio pushed the gate open a few feet, then took a step back, and bent to pick up the lock. Rob watched as Antonio started back upright, suddenly, and realizing that he saw something. The other man was moving slowly now, reaching for his shotgun, but staring back at them. No, past them, through the high beams at something behind the truck. Rob turned stupidly, then realized the cover hatch of the hauler blocked any rear view, and opened his door, leaning out to see. At first, his eyes couldn't see as they adjusted to the dark. Then his eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. Eyes, pairs of them, too many to count, shone back at him. Outside of the hauler, he heard them now, smelled them now, their whining, pawing, snorting, breathing, carrying in the cold air. They bellowed and dug their hooves into the ground, heads lowered, but staying just at the edge of the tree line, waiting. Rob reached slowly back into the truck for his .308 he had kept with him, his hand grasping it blindly but firmly. Then there was a deep and cacophonous cry from somewhere on the hill, like a battle trumpet being played, and they were moving. Rob couldn't believe that anything that big could be that fast. Pigs, some the size of cows, hurtled down the hillside toward them. They screamed and cried out with a frenzied rage. Antonio was shouting now, urging the truck forward and taking aim with his shotgun back the way they had come. He fired once, twice, and Rob saw one of the massive pigs fall before another one leaped over the body, the charge moving forward. Rob pulled his own rifle forward now, aiming down and holding it to his shoulder tight. Already the first of them had cleared the 100 yards or so and was almost to them. He found his mark on it and fired, tearing off a piece of the boar's face as it fell. But still, more came. Max was out of the truck now, and Antonio was shouting something at them. Then it was too late. Rob watched as the first of the pigs hurtled past Max, through Antonio, lifting the other man off of his feet and landing to the ground with a hard thud. There was a loud bang as the pig collided with the gate, knocking it backwards and off its hinges, before it kept running off and into the night. Antonio was almost back upright again, his knees under him, when the second pig struck him. Rob saw as the tusks ripped into him and the hooves trampled down on his chest. The squall was all over and all around them now. Max was firing blindly, moving away from the truck and toward a little grove of trees, perhaps to climb them. Rob never got to find out. Two of the boars broke from the herd and ran him down. The screams did not last long, and then it was only the sound of excited squealing he heard. Rob could not tell where one started and the other began. Clinging to the side of the hauler, Rob fired again, pulled on the bolt of his rifle, and fired a third time. Where or what he was hitting was beyond him, but he heard and understood the cries of pain when the shots landed. A pig rushed up beside him and forced its jaw around his leg, biting down hard and tearing through cloth and skin. He let out a cry of pain and disbelief, this thing from out of the night now holding firm to him, eating him. Rob put the rifle to its neck and shot, the head releasing him as he tried to pull himself back into the passenger seat. But he couldn't. All at once the hauler was moving again, pushing forward toward the gate and against the current of pigs that surrounded it. It jerked and bumped. Rob heard pigs cry out and saw Dale behind the wheel, his face gaunt and shocked, beyond understanding or reason. "Stop!" Rob cried out, losing his grip. "Jesus, Dale, stop the truck, I'm falling!" Rob didn't get to finish. He let go of the rifle too late, reaching back and twisted and fell over. Something hard kicked him in the head, and he saw stars. He rolled onto his side, keeping his hands up. A hammer came down on his leg, then another. Out of reflex, he crawled and reached outward and felt something solid and pulled himself toward it. Blinking, he felt the red wet running against his forehead as he righted himself.
The high beams of the truck bobbed along through the gate. Then all at once, something struck the side of the truck, and it began to turn, and then wobble. Again, Rob saw it rock and buckle as something pushed against the side of it, before it toppled onto its edge. The hogs surrounded the truck, looking so much like a turtle tipped onto its shell, pushing their noses against it and standing upon their hind legs, front hooves banging against the thin metal roof. A moment later, and the driver's side door opened skyward, and Rob watched as Dale began to pull himself out. The older man struggled against gravity, trying to leverage his weight to get his considerable belly over the lip of the door. The windshield gave out first, though, and one of the bigger hogs pushed through and into the cabin. Rob leaned against the fence and watched, half delirious with pain, as the hog pulled Dale back by his feet and drug him out of the hauler. There was no sense of malice in the act as the big hog and the others came down on him all at once. It was just eating another meal, Rob realized. And that was the worst part of it. The helicopter banged hard against the wind to keep them steady. Alice Kohler held the infrared goggles to her face with one hand and steadied herself with the other against the frame of the aircraft. She was one of the premier experts when it came to invasive wildlife. Insect swarms in the west, geese flocks along the coast, gators in Florida. She'd even had a very interesting case with Pablo Escobar's collection of hippopotamus not that long ago. But even for her, this was a first. It had taken the agency more than 4 days to respond to the initial reports. Not that it could have helped, she thought. What the hell was going on up here? What the hell was going to happen next? FEMA had prepared for a wide variety of scenarios, many of which the average person would consider ridiculous. The commonly thought of scenarios, floods, hurricanes, fires, and so on, were easy to imagine. But the agency was actually more creative than given credit for at first glance. Nuclear war, nuclear fallout, invasive insect species, mass desertification and starvation, alien invasions. The federal government had actually built out contingencies and plans of record should these events occur. But nothing, not even in the thought experimental and hypothetical procedures, did they plan for this. She watched and waited in the twilight at the edge of the hills for the first sign of them. Confirm we're on location. Over, she asked into the headset, keeping her eyes focused on the black and white landscape of the infrared below. Confirm, we are on location as directed. Over, said the pilot. They had called in a number of guys from state and federal wildlife, as well as a number of private contractors, mostly from the south, that would be here in a few days. But initial reports had been extreme. Massive invasive species, extreme forest damage, vast crop loss in the surrounding areas. There were even reports coming in now from a private section of the park where people were missing, including some business tycoon from Texas. The first of the white spots came around the corner between the hillsides now. It was big, bigger than she had expected. Illuminated under the infrared, it looked more like the bright white outline of a cow or bull. There was another. She was just adjusting the goggles to get a better look when she saw the third, and then the fourth. Then a dozen more. Jesus, she whispered, unheard over the thrum of the helicopter's engine. There were hundreds, she realized. The whole gully was packed, shoulder to shoulder with them. She watched trees sway and then buckle and fall as the sounder pushed through the land. They clawed up over the rocks and from between the bushes, trampling and whining and rooting. Holes in the side of the hill began to open, and they poured out, one over the other over the other. They trode over top of one another like streams of rats fleeing flooded pipes. So many all at once her eyes couldn't focus on just any one of them for too long. Alice watched as the pigs spread out of the gully, away from the forest, and spread out and down, moving south. She looked out at the far window of the helicopter, putting her goggles down, and thought of the land beyond. She thought of Boston, of Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and all the little towns and villages and fields between. She looked down at the swarm of hogs, because that's what it was now, a swarm, and wondered how far they would go. There were too many to stop now, too many running free for the men to round up or shoot. It would be an ecological disaster unprepared for, an epidemic unprepared for. How far would they go? How would any of them adapt? Beneath them, the squeals of delight and excitement rang upwards like a chorus.
Thank you very much for listening. Your thoughts and time are very valuable, so thank you for choosing to spend some of it here with me. Wherever you are out there, know that you are not alone and that we will be here to keep telling stories through the night. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe, and tell friends and family who like this sort of stuff. As an independent writer and artist, producing these works takes a ton of time and effort, done purely from a passion to tell stories. If you want to support me directly, please consider checking out my other works at www.fictionalpage.com, or become a patron at patreon.com/fictionalpage, or use the links below. Thanks for listening, and until next time.